If we really want to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal of reducing world hunger and malnutrition, we should first master the art, craft, and science of scaling up. After many decades of agricultural and food production research worldwide, we have now thousands of best managed practices and know-how that should be, in principle, allow us to produce enough food to feed the planet. However, there are still more than 100 million people in the world that have not enough to eat every day. There are several reasons for this mismatch between what we know and what we use in producing food and bringing it to the ones in need. One, certainly, is a lack of understanding on how to move from successful pilot tests and model interventions to make the same solutions applicable to work for a much larger number of people and over much wider geographical spaces. In a sense, we don't know very well how to scale up. And this is putting the brakes in our efforts to solve the food security crisis that we are in. Recognizing this bottleneck, CIFSRF was designed to test a range of different approaches and pathways for scaling up. The vast majority of CIFSRF projects have tried to scale up a range of products, innovations, methods, and models, all aiming to contribute to food security. Some have worked in limited geographical spaces, others have expanded to provincial or national scales, and others even have covered a group of countries. Some have used just one specific product or technology, while others have covered a wide variety of approaches and practices. As we will hear from our presenters, in most cases these efforts have paid off well, and in sum, the program has been able to impact more than 78 million users, directly influencing and benefiting at least 1.7 million farmers. This was well beyond our initial expectations. At CIFSRF, we also aimed at trying to distill some lessons by comparing across projects the different approaches that they have used, what have worked well and what not so well. We have some preliminary lessons coming from this synthesis. Others will be explored in more depth in coming publications in journals from several of the teams. And we thank you for your helping us advancing our understanding on this. Among the findings that we have so far, we know that for scaling up to be successful, it has to align several different elements. The first one is to select a solid innovation, one that responds to crucial needs of many people, which is based on scientific evidence and could be adapted to diverse contexts and circumstances. Over the CIFSRF program, a large number of innovations have been tested, and at the end, a total of 36 were scaled up. The second condition is that we have to find the right mechanism for scaling up. Some products are better suited to private sector engagement and are market-oriented. Others require government and policy interventions, while others still are based on knowledge sharing and capacity building. CIFSRF has tried all these approaches, sometimes individually, others in various combinations. The third condition is that we need to clearly identify at the beginning the right target number and appropriate geographical scopes. Are we trying to reach hundreds of farmers, thousands of farmers, millions of farmers, or a large number of millions of consumers? What is the geographical area that we are trying to reach? CIFSRF showed very clearly that there is a wide variety in the scale and the number of people that different projects can reach and influence their lives, and it could vary as well in their geographical focus. The fourth condition is that we need to involve the right partners. Given the context-specific nature of scaling up, not all the same actors are relevant universally. Identifying correctly and incorporating partners sometimes at diverse points in time during the scaling up process is therefore essential. The other additional condition is that a successful scaling up strategy needs to be able to adapt to changing contexts and realities. On the ground, those are very dynamic, as we all know. Prices fluctuate frequently, sometimes by ample margins. Agriculture is always affected by environmental factors. Political situation in countries and social constraints have usually enormous impacts in the decisions of farmers and consumers. Finally, for sustainability, we need strong leadership. And therefore, we need to identify champions who can take the innovations beyond project timeframes, as you have clearly mentioned in various examples in previous sessions. All this complexity leads to the realization that there is, unfortunately, not a blueprint or a recipe that is effective to reach scale for different products, practices, etc., across geographical boundaries. Some common patterns, however, have emerged, and you will find some of those distilled in the book prepared from CIFSRF. A final consideration is that scaling up shouldn't come at any cost. There is always the possibility that if we try to move it too quickly, too broadly, there might come with some unintended consequences. How can we really balance these tensions and these different driving forces that not always align properly? In a sense, how can we do what now is referred to as responsible scaling up? We don't have all the answers to these, but CIFSRF certainly has shed some light on some of the elements that we have to pay attention. Our panel of experts presenters will illustrate what we have achieved in practice, what have they learned and we learned in the process, and what we still don't know. Scaling up is a relatively novel field of research. We are confident that by deliberately embracing scaling up as a research component of our CIFSRF program, it helped to shed some light on the complex and challenging issues of appropriate, successful, and responsible scaling. And we want to acknowledge all of you because in most of the cases, you have learned scaling up theory and practice by doing. Most of you were not experts. We were not experts on the topic at the beginning, and we all have to walk the talk. And we really appreciate that contribution. I noticed that you were probably falling a little bit asleep, so I can ensure that from now on that will stop because our group of expert panelists will wake up us all with their engaging conversations and insights. Thank you very much, and let's move into our panelists. Thank you. And I will start by thanking my friend Andrew Msola from the African Fertilizer Agribusiness Partnership, who will be our first presenter. Thank you, Andrew.
It's not coming. Hello, good afternoon. I hope the IT guys will push the presentation there. I'm trying to pull it. Yeah, okay. Yeah, this activity was carried out in Tanzania, and it involved 3 institutions: CABI, FAP, and Fab Radio International. We were trying to scale up technologies, basically common beans and soybeans. What were the challenges? We had 3 challenges to more or less, which prompted us to go to this particular venture. One was the extent of malnutrition and stunting is quite big. And the other aspect was that the productivity level for the legumes, specifically for the common beans and soybeans, is still quite low. like 500 kgs per hectare compared to the average of 2 metric tons per hectare. And the other challenge was that we have technologies, yes, for the 2 legumes, but they are mainly remaining with the researchers. And there's very little knowledge, across reaching the smallholder farmers. So why legumes? As I said in my introduction, that malnutrition is also quite a big case. So we thought that since 75% of the smallholder farmers, of the population, depend on legumes as the major source for the proteins, so we thought it was really right to intervene. And also because of the nutritional value of the common beans and soybean, they are more or less like twice as much protein compared to meat, twice as much calcium, and twice as much iron. So that's why we picked those particular legumes. What technologies which we scaled up? They were quite simple technologies which could easily be scaled out and could easily be afforded by smallholder farmers. The first one was for the farmers to observe the right plant population, because we believe the first factor in increasing productivity is the number of plants per unit area. The other area where we really wanted to promote was for the smallholder farmers to be able to use fertilizer, the conventional one, and also the use of the inoculants for the legumes to enhance productivity. There was one presentation here in the morning where they were saying using less input. So this is one of the interventions. And then the third one was to enhance and encourage them to use improved seeds. So how did we do it? All the technical teams with other players. In Tanzania, we have a legume alliance. So we worked out a technical brief, which was also approved by the government, by the ministry responsible. So the very same technical information was transferred to the smallholder farmers using a multimedia campaign where we used demonstration plots. They were scattered in parts of the country, and one plot was 0.4 per hectare. They were big enough to attract the farmers to be able to observe the technicalities. So the same technical information went through the demo plots. The same technical information was transferred to the farmers using the farm radio. We had the farm radio listeners groups, which were scattered out through the project area. And the third intervention was the printed material. So with the same information, farmers could easily see through demonstration plots. Farmers could easily hear from the radio. They knew in a particular day, particular time, there's a radio program on common beans or on soybean. And then we had the printed material where farmers could also read. And our target groups were like four kinds. We had the smallholder farmers, where we had the leaflets. We are also targeting the extension staff, the village-based extension staff, and we had also targeted the agro-dealers. The agro-dealers were part of the project from the project inception, because the idea behind it was that we wanted to have a private sector arm from the beginning, because at the end of the day, farmers will always say, okay, we have seen this, we've been impressed by this particular variety, where are we going to buy? So we had the stockist ready with the project. We have seen the inoculants, yes, but where are we going to buy? So we use this particular approach to ensure that the message goes across. So what did we really achieve? We reached those numbers, around 700,000 smallholder farmers, and it might not be a very big number, but each particular year we had, the first year we had common beans, second year we had the soybeans. So those were the numbers reached, out of which 20% within that particular 1 year of getting the information were able to adapt. And what we are really seeing is that those who practiced increased the yield 3 to 4 times within the coming season. What we couldn't measure was the aspect of nutrition, which might maybe be coming later for other studies. So what have we really learned under this particular approach, scaling up approach, that we believe we have seen that consistent technical information delivered through a multimedia campaign-based approach, where we are using the demonstration, the radio, and the printed material, promotes uptake of technologies and can achieve impact to scale. But as a project, the members are saying that we now have evidence that a multimedia approach framed in a knowledge-based business model works. What we are seeing now, we ended up the activity last year, December, but what we are seeing now from the farmers, there's more demand for improved seeds, there's more demand for inoculants on their own, simply because the business sector was also fully involved. Now they are buying from the agro dealers. Thank you very much. I would really like to thank IDRC Global Affairs, to our program superiors, Marco and Wendy. They did a lot of guidance during the project execution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. And with that, I want to invite to the podium Dr. Pierre Apriconique from the University of Parakou in Benin.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to tell you how the MicroWeb Project improved the livelihood of population in West Africa using fertilizer microdosing and indigenous vegetable value addition. You know, indigenous vegetables are crops that people in West Africa are very attached to. They like these crops, but the value chain is not well organized. Farmers are not aware of what consumers want. Consumers are not aware of what farmers are producing. Indigenous vegetables are very rich in the nutrients, vitamins, minerals, pharmaceuticals, for instance, polyphenols, but they are underutilized. Why? Because first, soils are poor, and now farmers cannot afford buying chemical or fertilizer, so they are not using fertilizer at all. And the third thing is that there is no technology to add value to process these vegetables. And at the time, during the rainy season, when the production is more than the demand, there is a lot of waste. So what our project did was three categories of innovations. The first one, concerning the fertilizer microdosing. What is fertilizer microdosing? It targets 4 things. The first one, the type of fertilizer which will be good for leaves, either organic or mineral fertilizer. That is the first thing, the first point. The second one is where to apply the fertilizer. The best place to apply the fertilizer is close to the roots, and now the appropriate time when to apply this fertilizer. We found that it is just after transplanting or just after seeding, when the roots are there, the nutrients are there, and now the plant can take it up quickly and move. And last, which gives the name, is the reduced amount of fertilizer to optimize the yield. After this, we added value to this indigenous vegetable to diversify the way of consumption of people. First, we extract it from these indigenous vegetables, extract that were incorporated into breads, chin-chin, cookies, and most of the more consumed foods in our area. After that, we made, for the first time, syrup from these indigenous vegetables. We made syrup and juice, like you can see. And now, for scaling up, we use an innovative approach of scaling up innovation, which is called innovation platform. And we compared these innovation platforms with the ordinary used technology of scaling up, which is capacity building. We call it satellite dissemination. What is the difference between these two approaches? The satellite dissemination used to train people, to inform them, to build their capacity, giving them equipment, and so on. But the innovation platform does more than this. It puts all the stakeholders together. And you have farmers, you have input suppliers, you have transporters, you have marketers, and also you have consumers, apart from the researchers, all the institution donors and partners. And now they have to sit together to look at the problems that they have in the value chain and how they can solve it. And together, consumer can tell farmers the variety or the species they need, the quantity they need at what time, and this can help. What we achieved was amazing. When we were expecting 50,000 farmers to reach, we reached 6 times more farmers. We reached more than 300,000 farmers engaged in this fertilizer microdosing use. We improved income by more than 100% in the 2 countries. And we did something that was special. We engaged young ambassadors in the science and production of indigenous vegetables. We trained more than 100,000 students from primary school, secondary school, and universities. And all these schools have their own garden of indigenous vegetables. What they do, they learn the science of indigenous vegetable, and now they also produce an income from it. Apart from that, we trained more than 30,000 women in the processing of indigenous vegetables. And we learned that training, the dissemination approach is not enough. Capacity building is not enough. Cooperation is needed to bring simple, concrete, practical, and affordable technologies to scale. This is what we did. And at last, we found that this helped more women in the value chain than men. 3 more women were engaged in the system. I have to sincerely thank Global Affairs Canada, IDRC, and my colleagues from University of Nigeria, Professor Adeboye, Professor Oyedele, and Professor Pick, Professor Aluko from here, Canada, for this good job. We used to say in Africa that if a solution is getting complex, it's not probably a good solution. So we need simple solutions to solve difficult, complex problems. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Pierre. And then with that, I would like to invite our final presenter, Dr. Meena Jida from the India Nutrition Initiative. Thank you, Meena.
Imagine a country with a billion population. Imagine half the women in it at risk of complications during childbirth. Imagine half the children at risk of poor school performance. And now imagine if all this can be changed by just changing the salt in their kitchens. That is exactly what we are doing in India under the double fortified salt project. Iron deficiency anemia is widely prevalent in India and may lead to adverse health complications, such as complications during childbirth, poor cognitive performance in children, and reduced work capacity in adults. Double fortified salt has the potential to correct and also prevent iron deficiency anemia. The project is currently implemented in 3 states in India. I focus on one state, Uttar Pradesh, because most of our scale-up lessons and achievements come from that state. So in Uttar Pradesh, 52% of the children and 52% of the women and 63% of the children are anemic. Now, considering a population of 200 million, that translates to 50 million women and 15 million children in just one state. Responses to address this challenge have been in place for long, but have faced operational challenges like compliance. For instance, only 12% of pregnant women had consumed the recommended 100 doses of iron and folic acid tablets that is critical to overcome the increased iron requirement during pregnancy. Fortification has emerged to be a promising solution, and salt, being the only ingredient that is universally consumed, uniformly in uniform quantities daily, both by the rich and poor alike, makes it an excellent choice of food vehicle. However, DFS formulations introduced in the past in India have not been very acceptable to the people because of color changes in the food cooked with DFS. An innovative technology developed in the University of Toronto overcome this challenge by encapsulating the iron in the DFS. The ferrous fumarate core is given a coating of, is color masked, white color masked with titanium dioxide, and then given a steering coat to fix it in place. So that's a very simple but rather very innovative technology that overcome the limitation of discoloration of food and made this product really accessible and acceptable to people. How did we scale up? The technology was transferred to India with assistance from IDRC and CIFSRF by installing a premix production plant for local production of premix. I think that was very critical for the scale-up, because unless and until you have the capacities and the infrastructure in a country, you really cannot scale up a product. Along with that, the private salt manufacturers were trained on how to blend this premix with iodized salt to manufacture the double fortified salt. One critical innovation, or rather innovative strategy or approach that we adopted was utilizing an existing platform of a food security mechanism called the public distribution system. It has a pan-India presence, and that really helped us accelerate scale-up quickly. I'll be talking more about it later. Finally, we focused on product promotion and ensuring that this product was acceptable to the people, and people were willing to buy and use this product. So what have we achieved so far? Apart from the capacities in the country to produce the double fortified salt using the encapsulated technology, we also have created an enabling environment of scale-up in terms of having the private players on board, in terms of having government buy-in, and having the policies now in place in terms of guidelines at the federal level. So some achievements in numbers, speaking of the state of Uttar Pradesh, currently there are 8,700 delivery points distributing DFS every month to among 15 million beneficiaries. 40,000 metric tons, that is 40 million 1 kg bags of double fortified salt, have been distributed in the state of Uttar Pradesh alone. Based on our internal program data, we have reached to almost 95% of the target population, and 80 to 85% of the target population are consuming or rather purchasing the DFS regularly every month. We are soon going to have an external evaluation of the program in place. Some of the key lessons pertaining to scale-up that we learned were, first and foremost, large-scale application and scale-up of the encapsulated DFS technology is feasible in the country. Existing food safety mechanisms can provide a ready available platform and really accelerate scale-up. Now here I would like to emphasize that scalability is also a very dynamic and contextual thing. So we really have to focus on the existing infrastructure for scale-up. Leadership of the governments and buying by the government is very critical if we have to implement at scale and remove the financial barriers to availability and purchase of DFS. And finally, but not the least, multi-sectoral coordination and strategic partnerships among the public and private sector is very crucial to scale up. I would like to take the opportunity to introduce my team and recognize their contributions in the program. And also thank you very much for your patient listening. Thank you, IDRC. Thank you, CIFSRF. Thank you, Global Affairs Canada.
Thank you, Mina, and thank you to all our presenters and for these insightful remarks and presenting this fascinating set of projects. And now we would like to invite our panel of experts who can provide us with some of their reflections on how what you have here resonates with your own work, with your own initiatives, and help us understanding what other lessons we are driving for this and what you perceive as still gaps that we need to address in the near future. I'll invite first Virginie Levasseur from Sokodevi in Quebec, Canada, to start this reflection. Thank you, Virginie.
Bonjour, merci. Je vais faire ma...
Thank you. I will do my presentation in French, so I'll give you some time so you can put on your headset. Thank you very much for the organizers to inviting me for this panel. I'd like to summarize briefly, because we talk about innovation and scaling up. I'd like to remind you what is the uptake process in a few words, adding to what my colleague Isabel said yesterday. When we talk about innovation, we talk about individual who is facing a new practice, a new technology. And researchers, Rogers among others, have identified 4 main categories of factors which facilitate the take-up of a new innovation. The first group of factors, of course, is innovation itself, and the perception of the people regarding that innovation. Perception, of course, is influenced by age, and also by gender, whether you're a man or a woman, and your status in your family, influenced by our tolerance also to risk, by our access to various means of production, because you're in an agricultural environment, milieu. And all of these will affect the perception of an individual concerning innovation. The second group of factors, information and communication, as was mentioned several times. But who to receive the information from? Very important. Is it through radio or through a neighbor, a relative, or an association of producers who tell us about this new innovation? So our perception of innovation will change accordingly. Third main group of factors, the social system. So we spoke about the family, the friends and co-op, but also our environment. Are there any extension services in the environment? Is there a market that can receive the products? Are there any financial services so that we can invest in those innovations? All these have an important role to play in the take-up process. And the fourth factor, very important, of course, is time. This requires time. You have to take the time to do things well. I was trying to explain that the take-up process is a very complex process. And Rogers spoke about dissemination of innovation. He identified groups of individuals. About 2 or 3% of the populations are really leaders or innovators. And there are 12 to 13% of individuals who are early adopters. Those are the ones who take up innovations first. They come to you when you want to try out a new innovation. And usually you will develop innovations with their help when we talk about co-innovating with stakeholders. But scale up happens afterwards, when you want to take those innovations to the 2/3 of the population remaining. And when we talk about the very complex take-up process, for each of these individuals, the question as to whether they will adopt or take up that innovation, what benefit does it represent to them, and what are the risks to them, they will reflect on this aspect each time. So when you present an innovation package to a small-scale producer, you don't know which innovations will be adopted. That's why on a daily basis in practice, we suggest to choose those innovations that will have the greatest impact and really emphasize those to reduce the complexity and to make sure that those innovations that will be taken up by producers are those who will have the greatest impact, and of course, women included. I would like to underline also the challenge of partnership. We spoke greatly about research. In each of the projects presented, 30% of partners were people from NGOs. And there was also the presence of producers' associations. We shouldn't be afraid to talk about the problems of working with researchers and development workers. Sometimes the agenda is different. In research, you want to publish articles and reach people. Perhaps in the field of development, you don't need to publish as much, but you have other objectives. So I think we should really identify what are the challenges we face and what are the solutions we could implement in order to better work together, because that is extremely important. When we talk about scaling up, it's not just to pass the baton between research and development, but it's how to work together from the outset and throughout the process. Now, a last word, because my time is up. Scaling is important, interesting, but we have to be careful. Scaling up may face climatic constraints or market accessibility constraints. And scaling up an innovation to reach a large number of people, that's fine. But you have to make sure that you will really improve the living conditions of each person that you can reach. We should not forget that we work with people, and you want to work well with people. So perhaps this is not limited to one single innovation, but something more durable and complex. Thank you.
We wish to welcome Richard Cole from the Center for Large-Scale Social Change.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I particularly want to thank IDRC and the Global Affairs Canada for inviting me. It's a wonderful conference. I'm going to focus my remarks on what research on scaling and what it might be the next steps for many of these wonderful projects. I could talk about the strengths as well, but I only have a few minutes. So the first thing I want to say about scaling is that if you want to understand the next steps, we have to think that scaling is always about trade-offs. Unfortunately, most of the time, we don't have enough money to deliver everything at scale to all the people we would like with the impact that we've achieved at pilots. And I'm not arrogant enough to tell you where to make that trade-off, but I have yet to see a program or an innovation go to scale where that trade-off didn't exist. And so I'll talk about some of the areas where we can do research on how to make a more informed decision. One of the things that my previous speaker, Virginie, mentioned in the work of Rogers is that there are early adopters, or in the French, precocious adopters. I love that expression. Middle adopters and late adopters, and if you think about that and you graph it, actually over time it looks like an S-curve. And one of the ways we might want to think about it is, rather than do we need to have enough money if we're trying to reach, let's say, millions of people, do we need to really have enough money to touch all of those millions, or is it possible to create a critical mass so that would generate spontaneous scaling up? In other words, for every early adopter, there might be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 neighbors, friends, or relatives who might adopt. And many of the studies that were sponsored by CIFSRF, which I still can't pronounce after 2 days, have actually evidence, if you read the long evaluation papers, of spontaneous, what I call spontaneous or secondary adoption. And I think this is an extremely rich area for future research. Having been working on scaling up for over 15 years myself, nobody has done this kind of research in developing countries. And this is particularly rich because over the last few years, sociologists and anthropologists now have a better understanding of social networks, social mapping, and I'm not talking about Facebook, I'm talking about traditional social networks, but we still don't really understand who are the key, what are called nodes or influencers. And is the ratio 2 to 1 for every person we touch directly with a program, 3 to 1 or 5 to 1, or whatever the number is, and what are the things that we can do in terms of training or the key selection of these early adopters that might increase that ratio? And I think we have a very rich data set here that could be exploited. The second point I want to talk about is the need to simplify the innovation, which also Virginie touched on. And if you look at the summary paper that CIFSRF has written on this, they talk about trimming. And some of the considerations I want to talk about is, first of all, almost all the things that I've seen here that have been scaled, including 2 of the panelists, had multiple things in their package. So, for example, fertilizer microdosing also included spacing, as did the legume thing. So we know that the more complicated the intervention, the more difficult to scale, but we also have evidence on which of the members of the innovation package, and I really think it's important to think of the innovation as a package, people adopted first or second or third. Were it the cheapest? Was it the easiest? Were it the things that were not the most different from what people were already doing? This, again, is an incredibly rich area for research, and we have wonderful data from all the things that have occurred. Secondly, if we're trying to, one of the key things that's a challenge in scaling up in terms of creating this secondary or spontaneous is we're not going to provide extension support to the secondary adopters. They're going to learn from their neighbors or from the people we did touch. Well, what do we know about our innovations, whether the impact will degrade or decay, like radioactive decay, if they're being scaled up? Will the impact, if people don't do it properly, do you get 90%, 80%, 50%, or 0? Because in that case, if it's low, then an indirect approach is not going to work. Similarly, we had some very important innovations on the panel today about using information technology, radio, and other things. Which of the things, if you want a high, what's called in the literature, fidelity, or if you need fidelity to the original quality of the intervention, of the adoption of the good agricultural practice, does it work if you hear it over the radio, or do you really need someone to show you? And again, these are all incredibly rich areas for research. And finally, because most of these are packages, unfortunately, and it's expensive to do it, but I know in Canada there's all sorts of money up here because of the incredibly rich country this is, can we actually do this on an evidence basis? What happens to a farmer if they only adopt one innovation? If it's the legume seeds versus the spacing versus the fertilizer? And so if we do want to trim, we have evidence to say, well, if you only do this one, you get 80%. If you only do this one, you get 50%, et cetera, et cetera. So these are all very rich. I want to make a few other points about this, and that is that when you actually go to large scale, and when I use the word large scale, what I mean is a significant percentage of the denominator. And obviously, depending upon the intervention in the place, the denominator in some places may be 1 million. If we're in India, the denominator is going to be in the hundreds of millions or maybe even 1 billion. But if we're talking about 20, 30, 50, 75% of whatever that denominator is, a few things will usually happen. First of all, every single one of the 3 panelists invested and took care of strengthening value chain institutions. Well, that's a key part of scaling up. Who's going to do that at large scale? Who's going to strengthen the value chain in salt or legume seeds for an entire country like Tanzania, okay? Is it the government? Does the government really have the capacity and the political will to do that? Or is it, why would a commercial company, even if it's a seed company, decide to strengthen the distribution system? Can they really make money out of producing and selling legume seeds enough to cover creating the distribution, providing extension support, etc.? So this key question is, who's going to be what I call the intermediary, or take those next steps to strengthen the market system, create demand, provide extension support, etc.? Another consideration, and I know I'm out of time, but just give me another couple minutes, is that it's one thing to, the worst enemy we have of scaling up is our own success. And what do I mean by that? When you increase productivity by 200 or 300%, for 10,000 or 100,000 farmers, that's not a big deal. I mean, it's a big deal for them, but it's not a big deal for the market. If you do that for 100, 500,000 or 1 million, all of a sudden the supply of legumes or indigenous vegetables has doubled or tripled nationally. Well, you don't have to be a PhD economist to know that if you increase supply by 200 or 300%, what happens to prices, and does that undermine the business case or the profitability? So one of the things to think about is, how do you address or anticipate that? And particularly, for example, in things like maize or legumes, one of the ways to go with that, I know we're talking about food security, but to start thinking about downstream innovations such as yogurt, if we're increasing milk supply, or other value-added products like animal feed or things like that. So the last thing I want to say is that at small scale, there are very few losers. At big scale, there are often losers. And what I mean by loser are the vested interests, people who are, for example, producing other products that you're replacing, and they're going to fight back. I can tell you, scaling up, despite we think of it as an economic or an agronomic or food security issue, is also a political issue in the small sense of the word. What are you going to do to anticipate and head off the losers who are probably going to fight the scaling up of this innovation? So thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. And let's invite our final panelist for the session, Professor Sir Vic Boldus from University of Wageningen in the Netherlands. Thank you, sir.
I think this scaling panel has been particularly good at scaling up the allocated time for addresses. So I'll try to scale it down a bit. I typed it out. So framing things as, well, first of all, I want to really thank for inviting me here to this really special event, really rich in reflections and presentations. I really enjoy it. So framing things as scaling innovations is all the rage, as they say these days, in the context of research and development initiatives. The general consensus seems to be that scaling innovations is good. If the innovation was good, scaling it up surely must bring something even better. And yes, some things only work at scale, and some things only become affordable at scale. And some things seem to work everywhere without significant side effects. Maybe the hexanol, or maybe vaccinations should fall in that category. But many of the global problems we face as humanity, also locally, stem from innovations which went to scale in the past. That should make us modest and cautious. There's a problem in equaling innovations, often technologies, to solutions, generalizable solutions. Such solutions thinking forgets that something becomes a solution only when it solved something somewhere for somebody. Solution can never be considered the general status of a particular innovation or technology. I've heard and read about great stories of change these days, and certainly that's something to celebrate. But then that's not considered to be enough. No, all this has to be scaled up. And I think that often it's insufficiently realized that you then enter a distinct new dynamic. And that's where I think there's a tendency to cut corners. So in the following, I will just run quickly through a couple of bullet point reflections, maybe rocking the scaling boat a bit in doing so. One, the term scaling up is actually not that helpful, really. It conceals what exactly scales on what type of scale. Scaling innovations will always involve many things scaling, not just one isolated thing. And it will relate to different types of skills, organizational skills, application skills, institutional skills. We can think of hundreds of skills. Such realities of multiple interacting scaling processes need to be unpacked and understood better. And we need to be aware of the fact that scaling rhetoric belongs to a particular development paradigm which may be contested. 2, when things go to scale, new dynamics start to play out which we often not anticipated. This is because of cumulative effects of scaling innovations, because of the interplay between different scaling innovations and the interplay with ongoing scaling processes in society. We often lack a sense of to what scale level benefits outweigh the negative effects, such as a study that I did myself on rubber cultivation in southwest China. It brought financial affluence to many, but at the cost of environmental degradation, immense loss of biodiversity, even change of the local climate and cultural erosion. Many more examples can be given. This also points to the need for responsible governance of scaling innovations, since it will not be possible for each individual project to consider such complexities. 3, related to this, when things go to scale, what started as an agricultural issue may easily affect or be affected by health issues, environmental issues, cultural issues, political issues. And the agricultural problem solved at scale may be the beginning of an environmental or health problem at scale. Hence the need for holistic frameworks to guide decision-making. Contributing to a specific SDG requires considering all of the SDGs. Business models need to do total cost accounting, not just focus on the, for example, economic side of things. And we need foresight thinking. What if this goes to scale? And as a result, what will scale down or be replaced? Something we may regret later. Think of the millet case in India. Monoculture fails to accept that it is diversity which breeds resilience, but it is a typical result of scaling innovations. 4, scale what needs scaling, not what is easy to scale. I heard someone say, and been heard more often, we have to simplify innovations and then use mass communication strategies. Well, is that going to change the lives of the poor? Gary Hogan of the International Justice Mission puts it like this: if we do not address justice, development efforts, however good they are, will not lead to sustainably improved lives of the poor, notably the poorest of the poor. And that's what IDRC focuses on. Scaling justice, or let justice flow like rivers. Which of the projects addressed this? Are we over-focusing on things we can count, on the material type of things? Scaling justice will not be appreciated by some of the powerful. And I know also mentioned the issue of power at the close of yesterday. Scale tends to attract power. So we need to think about food ethics, food justice, and food sovereignty. I close with some quick questions as food for thought. Are we reviving the old blueprint approaches by the focus on scaling innovations? What legitimizes that you try to change behavior at scale? And rather than trying to scale fixed innovations as solutions, why not look for the kernel of success in a particular innovation, strip it of its context-specific configurations, and work with that at scale towards new configurations and diverse and adapted applications in context? This also links to what Santiago said in his opening speech today about how people change technology so it becomes their own. Okay, so all these questions point to the need to improve our understanding of consequences and implications of scaling innovations and what makes for responsible scaling of innovations. So I've rocked the scaling boat a bit. That was the idea. But I want to end on a positive note. I like that many projects took a more integrated approach than the reductionist title suggested, which sometimes were a bit misleading, as if the project was just about this or that innovation technology. Also, I like very much that a number of IDR staff are currently seriously rethinking the idea and practice of scaling innovations. So this was a critical reflection. In brief, if you're interested in more, there's an open access book on this that just came out, which elaborates along these lines. Thank you.
Thank you, Sirp, and thank you to all our panelists. I think you gave us a lot of food for thought, and that's a perfect